Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We would like to extend a very warm welcome to each one of you at the nice global conclave from the laps of the beautiful Himalayas, where the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is located. The think tank was established in the month of February in the year 2016. It undertakes independent research in the field of international relations, foreign policy, security studies, and development. NICE has 4 research centers: China Studies, Neighborhood Studies, Non-Traditional Security Studies, and Security and Strategic Studies. The institute focuses on 8 research topics: climate change and energy, global governance, sustainable development and smart cities, refugee and migration, China's Belt and Road Initiative, border and transboundary water politics, Indo-Pacific affairs, disaster management, and international economy and development. Previously, NICE has had the opportunity to host distinguished speakers from all around the globe.
It was a great pleasure inviting me to speak here at NICE.
It's a real pleasure to be able to speak with all of you.
Well, thank you anyway, and I certainly admire the work that you're doing.
I'm very happy to be with you all.
NICE Global Conclave is the flagship event of the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement, Nepal. The theme of the 3-day conference is Connecting Nepal to the World by bringing leaders, diplomats, business leaders, and scholars from all around the globe. The objective of the conclave is to introduce Nepal to the world and at the same time update the Nepalese policymakers and experts about the fast-changing geopolitics, which will help Nepal reshape its foreign policy to achieve its national goal. This is the session P of the conference, and to chair and moderate this session, it's a real pleasure to have with us Professor Dr. Swaran Singh. Professor Dr. Swaran Singh is Professor for Diplomacy and Disarmament at Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He is President of Association of Asia Scholars, General Secretary of Indian Association of Asian and Pacific Studies, Guest Professor at Research Institute of Indian Ocean Economies, Union University of Finance and Economics, China, and Advisory Board member of Atlanta-based Communities Without Borders INC. He has been visiting professor and a member of the editorial board of several reputed universities and journals around the world. Professor Singh has co-edited Transforming South Asia, Imperatives for Action, India and the GCC countries, Iran and Iraq, Emerging Security Perspectives on China by India, from civilization to state, etc. Without any further ado, sir, I request you to take the session forward.
Thank you. I'm delighted to moderate this session. I hope you are able to hear me loud and clear.
Perfectly, sir.
Okay, thank you. So let me say that I think it's a significant session, and we already have about 47 participants with us now. And given my experience of earlier sessions, I think number is going to really go up very fast. Session is significant for 2 reasons. One, we have a luminary of a whole panel of luminaries speaking on Indian foreign policy, but also the fact that the foreign policy of India itself has become a subject of great interest around the world. You could find many reasons for that. What many people call modification perhaps is one of the reasons. You would know that after Twitter suspended the account of President Donald Trump, Prime Minister Modi is the most popular leader to be followed on Twitter with, I think, about 64.7 million Twitter followers. Add to that, what I remember the last count was about 109 visits to 60 countries. And of course, great events like Howdy Modi and diaspora meetings wherever he goes. And for the first time, we actually have retired ambassadors sort of coming together, taking positions in media. So in that sense, it so appears that the conventional debates of Nehruvian paradigm or Curzonian imprint or even Mughal influence, even Indira and Gujarat doctrine are kind of, getting marginalized as a whole new focus on how India's foreign policy, at least the footwork, and the experts will soon tell us the outcomes, but at least the footwork is clearly visible in terms of foundational agreements, one after another. The first one took about 14 years, and next 3 years have seen all the 4 foundational agreements being signed, 2+2 dialogues being initiated. Now we are talking of pandemic diplomacy, vaccine Maitri. With China, 22 rounds of working group, working mechanism discussions, 11 recently on the border. Similarly, back channel conversations with Pakistan, Dawal, with Moeed Yusuf, even General Hamid. We are even talking to Taliban now. So at least the footwork doesn't miss you, the hyper footwork, which has kind of become the focus of foreign policy of India recently. I am lucky that the panel has kind of crafted as to what each of the speakers would be speaking on for the first 9 minutes. We will have this panel beginning with Professor Rajesh Rajagopalan. He will be speaking on the changing strategic choices and their impact on India's foreign policy, followed by Xuan will be speaking on India's look or act east policy. Then Dr. Jacob will be speaking on Modi government's engagement with Pakistan and Afghanistan. Dr. Sreeradha Datta is speaking on India's neighborhood policy, neighborhood first policy, with particular focus on, I suppose, Bangladesh, which is her great expertise. And then final presentation by Dr. Blarel will be on India's West Asia policy, focusing on GCC countries. So in that sense, I think it's a good coverage of various both thematic and regional focused issues here. And we will have an excellent discussion, I am assuming, and I look forward to questions and comments. So therefore, as the NICE team has already decided that we will put enough weightage on discussion later, so they have asked us to limit our initial remarks to maximum 9 minutes. So let me stop here and invite my colleague, Professor Rajesh Rajagopalan. And I don't have to introduce each of the panelists. All of you can Google their name and you will find enormous numbers of entries on their names. So let me just begin by asking Professor Rajesh Rajagopalan to begin his first initial remarks, and we'll have discussion later. Rajesh.
Thank you, Prof. Swaran Singh, and my thanks to Dr. Pramod Jaswal and NICE for inviting me to give a talk here. It's good to be back. I was here yesterday also. Again, keeping with the fact that time is limited, I will make 5 quick points and then later happy to sort of elaborate on them or clarify any of these points. So the first point I want to make is that Indian foreign policy has been characterized by continuity rather than change over the last 70 years or so. This continuity has, of course, been well noted in the literature on Indian foreign policy, and there have also been attempts to sort of explain that continuity. I'm not sure that I would necessarily agree with all of those explanations, but the continuity itself has been well noted. Obviously, there have been some temporary disruptions, 62, 71. And even the end of the Cold War were seen as disruptions. But if you look at it, the longue durée sense, rather than look at the details, one can still see a longer period of continuity. These 62, 71, whatnot were not really major significant changes. I would argue that the primary reason for that continuity has been that India has remained the dominant power in the Indian subcontinent within this region, and because it has been the dominant power, it hasn't really faced any great requirement to change its foreign policy or to change its approach to doing foreign policy. Now, China, of course, has mattered in terms of the Sino-Indian border, but for the South Asian balance itself, it has not been that relevant. And I'm talking historically, I will come to the present in a minute. For the South Asian security balance itself, China has been not as important, despite, of course, the Sino-Pakistan axis, which was important, but did not really fundamentally change the South Asian balance. So, given that continuity on of the strategic circumstance, Indian foreign policy therefore has remained fairly steady in terms of the broad outcomes. The second point I'd make is that this is bound to change now because of India's relative decline. For the last, since 1991, India obviously has grown, the economy has grown. But at the same time, even though India has grown, relative to China, India has declined. I mean, in terms of relative power, India has actually declined because obviously China has grown much faster. And so what matters is not so much the absolute growth that India has had, but the relative growth relative to China. And by that measure, India has actually declined. One of the surprising things when you look at Indian foreign policy analysis is that many, at the popular level, but even among scholars and analysts, there is an impression that India was always weaker than China. But that is not necessarily true. I mean, there was a military balance at the border that favored China to some extent, but of course, China was a nuclear power and a P5 member and all of that. But overall, if you look at overall power in terms of GDP and whatnot, India and China were roughly the same until the late 1980s, early 1990s. Of course, now China is 5 times India's power, and so that's a dramatic change. So that change is bound to cause significant changes in Indian foreign policy also. And the third point that I'd make is that the foreign policy change now is not temporary, unlike in 65, 62, 71, etc., or even the nuclear deal, where there were sort of temporary changes in Indian alignment, Indian sort of attitudes. What we are seeing now, though, is a fundamental, long-lasting change because of the India's relative decline, and that means that is not going to change immediately. The India's relative decline and the balance of power with China, because that's much deeper. So therefore, you see, to some extent, a qualitatively different U.S.-India relations today compared to anything in the past. I mean, even if you compare it to India's Soviet relations in the Cold War, this is a qualitative relationship. We have the Quad and the kind of military exercises and so on and so forth. So it's a much deeper alignment than what India had even with Russia during the Cold War. Within the region, that's the fourth point that I made. If you look at the South Asian region itself, this is likely to lead to much greater tension because within the region, obviously, China is now a much more important player. China is actually now a South Asian player, unlike it was not during the Cold War period until about 10 years or so back. And therefore, the region, the smaller countries within that are India's neighbors, have many more choices. I mean, earlier, of course, Pakistan had that, but today it's not just Pakistan, but also Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, even Bhutan has choices, and those choices in terms of dealing with India, and those choices specifically coming from China, which basically means coming as a consequence of support from China, which means that India will have to work a lot harder within the region. So the region itself becomes a source of insecurity for India in a way that it hasn't been through much of the Cold War period of even until about 15 years back. So finally, to sort of conclude, to look at the future, I would argue that major structural changes like this won't change overnight, and so this is likely to last. Even now, and not related to the pandemic, even prior to the pandemic, the gap between India and China has been growing, despite India's faster growth rate. And even if China were to grow slightly slightly less fast and India were to grow faster than China, it still would not lead to any decline in the gap between India and China unless there is a India grows significantly faster than China over decades. I mean, it's not, so this is not going to change in the immediate future. I mean, alternatively, China will have to collapse, something of that kind, which is of course not going to happen, not something that we can predict in any case. And so that extent sort of the change in the balance of power, the change in the strategic situation that India faces is something that India will have to live with for a considerable period of time. And so if the current trajectories continue, therefore, I would argue that India will continue to get ever closer to the US and the Quad and whatnot. And as a consequence of both the changed strategic circumstance, but also of the Indian response to that, Sino-Indian relations will remain problematic, and as a consequence, further within the region also there will be continued difficulties. So let me stop here. I will be happy to sort of expand on any of these points later during the discussion. Thank you. Thank you, Swaran.
Thank you, Rajesh, for setting up excellent timing. You took 8 minutes instead of 9, so I think that is going to be very efficient. The next speaker we have is Dr. Xuan. He is the Deputy Director General of Institute of Southeast Asian Studies from Vietnam's Academy of Social Sciences, and he's speaking on India's look and activist policy. Dr. Pho, floor is yours now.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Swaran Singh. Thank you, Nicolas, for inviting me to the conference. I think to save time, I will go straight to my presentation. The title of my presentation is Vietnam in India's Look at its Policy. That is the title. As many know, India's Look at its Policy was launched in the beginning of 1990s after the collapse of Soviet Union and the domestically the danger of India's economic collapse, among others. In 2014, at the India-ASEAN Summit held in Myanmar, India Prime Minister Narendra Modi announced to upgrade LAF into EAP, its policy. By launching LAF, India aimed at integrating into economic and political dynamics of Asia Pacific, especially Southeast Asia, where India has deep cultural, religious, and people-to-people linkages. Another factor that I really want to emphasize here is that by launching LAB, India also aims at enhancing its influence in Asia Pacific, especially in South Asia, to counterbalance with China's growing influence in South Asia, where India has considered as its traditional sphere of influence. In India's look-its policy and then act-its policy, Vietnam plays an important role because of at least 4 reasons. The first, Vietnam and India are traditional friends. The most important thing is that India and Vietnam have mutual trust and confidence. Second, Vietnam is an immediate neighbor of China and share with India the same historical heritages in their relations with China, such as wars. That is the thing we have to accept. Third, Vietnam is the most consistent and radical claimant challenging China's illegal claim in the South China Sea, the most strategic location for confluence competition in South Asia. And fourth but not least, Vietnam is also a large trade and investment market for India also. Because at least 4 reasons above, India has treated Vietnam as one of the most important partners in its labs and active policy. In terms of political, the first visit of Prime Minister Narasimha Rao to South Asia after becoming the Prime Minister of India was to Vietnam in 1994. And then the first South Asian country that Prime Minister Vajpayee visited was also Vietnam in 2001. Prime Minister Vajpayee even called Indonesia and Vietnam as 2 important ASEAN countries and 2 traditional allies Let me quote. As I return to India after a week-long visit to Vietnam and Indonesia, I see a new spring of hope in us engagement in these two important Asian countries. I return with profound satisfaction and with the confidence that our relations with these two traditional allies and with the Southeast Asia region as a whole will yield a good harvest of greater cooperation and prosperity in the coming times. Quoted ended. Excluding the US and Russia, Vietnam is the fourth country in Asia Pacific that built a strategic partnership in 2007. After Japan in 2000, China and Indonesia in 2005. Especially the Indo-Vietnam strategic relationship was upgraded to a comprehensive strategic partnership in 2016. Only after Indo-Japan relationship was upgraded to a specific and global strategic partnership in 2015, and now is before the enhancement of India and Indonesia's ties to comprehensive strategic partnership in 2018. Vietnam and India also established a strategic dialogue mechanism since 2009, which is mostly between countries having strategic mutual trust and confidence. That's from my viewpoint. In terms of defense and security, Vietnam is among few countries in South Asia that India has supported to train pilots and sailors operating submarines. Vietnam seems to be the only country in South Asia that India offers the credit line for purchase of speed patrol vessel. And the first one was launched in 2021 this year. In terms of trade, Vietnam has become an important trading partner of India in Asia Pacific. In the fiscal year 2016-2017, Vietnam officially replaced Thailand to become India's fourth largest trading partner in ASEAN. After Indonesia, Singapore, and Malaysia, with the bilateral trade reached $1.1 billion US. And by fiscal year 2019-2020, Vietnam continued to replace Malaysia to become the third largest trading partner of India in ASEAN, just after Singapore and Indonesia only, with the value of bilateral trade reached $12.34 billion US. And from my personal viewpoint, Vietnam has become one of India's major trading partners in Asia Pacific, and Vietnam joined in the club of over 10 billion trade partners in Asia Pacific. And now I come to prospect of the Vietnam's role in India's ASEAN policy. The rise of both India and Vietnam, the role of Vietnam as a trustful political and trading, a large trading partner of India, along with China's ambition in the South China Sea and South Asia, India's enhancement of its policy and its participation in Quadrant Security Dialogue, or Quad, will further enhance Vietnam in the Vietnam relations in the years to come. And then Vietnam continue to play an important role in India's ASEAN policy in particular, and India's vision of Quad in general. I conclude my presentation here very short. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Dr. Vo, for excellent timing again. I understand that Vietnam is a very, very unique and very important country in Southeast Asia for India to engage for various reasons, including now the defense cooperation and strategic cooperation, as also the historical linkages of Ho Chi Minh's correspondence with Indian leaders. So it's a very, very significant and critical relationship in promoting India's Act East policy in coming times. We now have next speaker. I don't see him on my screen as of now. Dr. Happymon Jacob is the next speaker, if he is in the room where his laptop is. Yes, I can see him. Yes, Dr. Jacob, Now you can begin, and Dr. Jacob is, as you know, one of the most prolific writers on India's foreign policy. You possibly follow his op-eds in Hindu. He's going to speak to us on Modi's policy, Modi government's policy towards Pakistan and Afghanistan. Dr. Jacob, floor is yours now.
Thank you, Professor Swaran Singh. What I will do in this presentation very briefly is to sort of try and understand the rationale behind India's AFPAC policy. I make three broad points and I'll sort of elaborate on them thereafter. My 3 points are: one, New Delhi is quite concerned about post-American Afghanistan, the potential return of the Taliban to the Afghan scheme of things, and Pakistan's increasing influence in Afghanistan via various entities. India is also worried about the open strategic convergence between China and Pakistan on the Kashmir question. My second argument is that India's desire to stabilize the Pak-Afghan front, at least partially, it explains the current outreach to Pakistan and to the Kashmiri political leadership. Thirdly, Pakistan's desire to consolidate its gains, quote unquote, in Afghanistan, as well as to mend its relations with the United States, partially explain its outreach to India. Now, let me explain these 3 arguments in some detail. First of all, India has over $3 billion worth of investment in Afghanistan, which would come in harm's way once the US troops pull out of Afghanistan and the Taliban becomes more powerful with active Pakistani backing. Many more countries today are favorable to the Taliban, unlike last time. But New Delhi's contacts with the Taliban are so far negligible at best. And India has had for a very long time put all its eggs in President Ghani's basket, insisting that it would only deal with the elected government in Afghanistan, and didn't provide the Taliban recently. Certainly, it's a policy in the last couple of years, but a bit too late in my personal opinion. The legacy of the Kandahar hijack, the IC-814 hijack, and the ideological reasons perhaps prevented the BJP government from developing relations with the Taliban. But I mean, to be fair to the BJP government, even the previous UPA government, even though in 2010 you had then Foreign Secretary talking about good Taliban, bad Taliban, even the UPA government was not very proactively engaging the Taliban. I think public opinion in India has not been very favorable to talking to the Taliban, who were widely viewed, and rightly so, as the Lankies of Pakistan. There is also perhaps an ideological reason for the BJP, the aversion of being seen talking to an Islamist terror group, as it were, which Taliban is. If so, there is also another question that could be asked: if you can talk to the Taliban, why not to the Kashmiri militants, right? I mean, so I think that this is a complicated ideological reason, as it were. And thirdly, so unlike the pre-2001 days, there is little appetite in the international community today to put up an opposition to the Pak-sponsored Taliban via some kind of a northern alliance, right? On the contrary, what you're seeing today is that the China, the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Contact Group for Afghanistan, and even China might be directly or indirectly helping the Pakistani strategies in Afghanistan. So India may have very little say in how things unfold in Afghanistan in the days to come. So in the wake of the August 2019 Kashmir decision by New Delhi, Pakistan had gone on overdrive to heat the violence in Kashmir, in which it was partially successful, I would say. You had increasing a line of control firing. In fact, the highest amount of firing in 2020 after 2002, perhaps. You had infiltration spiking, and terrorist violence in Jammu and Kashmir increased. Had this continued, New Delhi would have found itself in a difficult position, even as the Afghan situation folded to its disadvantage, with potential spillover into Kashmir. Now, when I say spillover into Kashmir, what I have in mind is not directly the Afghan fighters like in '89 came to Kashmir, but a lot of inspiration coming from there for the Kashmiri youth, and also the Pakistanis would sort of trumping up that inspiration with all kinds of help. However, by reaching out to Pakistan via the back channel, as Professor Singh pointed out, to the ISI chief and the NSA in Pakistan, it appears that India initiated the talks, at least going by some reports. I think New Delhi has not given up on its stand on terrorism. So while you have reached out to Pakistan, but that doesn't mean I think India has given up on its insistence on the issue of terrorism. Let me explain that a bit. So let me take you back to 2019. By carrying out an airstrike against Pakistan in the KP province, New Delhi created a sort of a new military normal with Pakistan. That is, counter-terrorist strikes inside Pakistan would occur in case of a terror attack against India, notwithstanding the Pakistani response, which, as the ensuing air skirmish showed, is likely to remain at the low conventional level. Now, there was a lot of talk before 2019 that, this could sort of escalate to the nuclear levels, that, this and the other, but all that seemed to sort of laid to rest in 2019. In other words, New Delhi has clearly signaled to Pakistan how far it will tolerate the menace of terrorism emanating from there. New Delhi has also indicated to Islamabad how far it will be flexible on the Kashmir question, right? By having only a ceasefire agreement in February this year on the line of control and no talks on Kashmir yet. The ruling and ruling out the return of Article 370 to Kashmir, New Delhi has made its intents on Kashmir pretty clear, and Pakistan, in my opinion, has very little choice but to accept it. And Pakistan seems to have accepted the Indian offer vis-a-vis Kashmir. So on the terror question, there seems to be a clear signaling from India. On the Kashmir question, there seems to be a certain signaling from India. On the Pakistani side, I think there are compulsions also for accepting this less than perfect deal offered by India. Pakistan tried to, in the wake of the 2019 decision by India, internationalize the Kashmir issue, but there are few takers for its position, right? Including the, and this is something I think Nicolas will come in on. Even in the West Asian region, there were little backing for the Pakistani position. Pakistan tried to heat up the Kashmir situation internally, but there were again no takers for it was to no avail. Pakistan has also, I mean, frankly speaking, no moral legitimacy to talk about the reorganization of J&K. This is an internal issue, right? It has done, Pakistan has done that and more in Pew, okay, if you ask me. In any case, Pakistan had traditionally said Article 370 is not a replacement for quote-unquote self-determination of the Kashmiris. More crucially, the GHQ in Pakistan, the Pakistan Army, needs time and space today to consolidate its spoils in Afghanistan and cannot afford to be diverted. And therefore, they are also willing to sort of have this tow with India and also in Kashmir. So the current tow, in my opinion, and I just take another minute and a half, the current tow is unlikely to last for very long unless the two sides are able to make concessions to each other. Pakistan needs what I call, quote unquote, an honorable exit route from Kashmir. If it doesn't get it, it will come back someday to the valley when the time is ripe, and there would be disgruntled elements in Kashmir who would join forces with them. India wants to ensure that its interests in Afghanistan are not harmed, and that Pakistan doesn't seek to disrupt the status quo in Kashmir. The China factor, finally, I think will deeply influence India's AFPAC policy. If China continues to heat up the LAC, it might have implications, and what those implications are is something that we'll have to wait and see for India's northwest, northwest front, as it were. However, what is interesting is that while the summer standoff with China was on, Pakistan did not try to take a military advantage of that on the line of control, but fearing that the Indian side might vent their anger on the weaker side, Pakistan. So I think what I'm trying to say is that the current Indian strategy in the AFPAC region is a well-calculated move, but also a result of the unfolding strategic environment in the region. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Dr. Jacob. Again, I'm looking forward to the discussion part. Hopefully, each of the panelists will get enough time to again expand on these very, very synoptic presentations that they are doing. Thank you for each of you staying with time. The next speaker is an old friend of mine, Dr. Sreeradha Datta, and we were together at IDSA, and then she left, of course, to take over as director of Maulana Abul Kalam Azad Institute of Asian Affairs in Kolkata. She's back in Delhi as senior fellow at Vivekananda International Foundation. And she's one of India's foremost experts on Bangladesh. So I assume when she talks about India's immediate neighborhood, she would have something to tell us on that. And congratulations, she has just published a book on Act East policy and Northeast India, Northeast of India, I suppose, which is being very well received also. So we are looking forward to your initial presentations and discussion later. Sreeradha, floor is yours now. You have to unmute, Sreeradha.
Yeah, thanks, Swaran. Warm greetings to all of you on my panel. And I would like to note deep appreciation for what Pramod and his team is doing. It's amazing what he's put together. So as all of you know that I'm speaking about India neighborhood, let me begin with a quote from T.S. Eliot. Between the idea and the reality, between the motion and the act, falls the shadow. For all of us, foreign policy watchers, and especially those with an interest in the Indian neighborhood, would have noted that irrespective of how India engages with the neighbor, what it does not do, looking out for the shadow is actually a critical imperative, because that, I feel, is actually the window of a clearer understanding of the ground realities. Let me start with few broad points, and if time permits, I'll draw some few specific examples and strands. The other day, a co-panelist mentioned about this period being the age of policy and security. I think for the neighborhood, it really is so. There is absolutely no one fit in a very rapidly changing world of the neighborhood. Let me begin with the neighborhood first policy. I think Professor Swaran had made a reference to that in his initial remarks. I essentially argue that while it works very well as a reference point for us researchers in the academia, but in real terms, it actually has translated into disappointment, resentment, and raised far more issues than it has answered. It's possibly also highlighted the gaps rather than focusing on progress that has been undertaken in the neighborhood. It's a fact that without a doubt that the issues of structural asymmetries and the suspicion that results from this unevenness have always existed in the region. And I think that has always continued to define the relation that India shares with the neighbors. Flowing from this, I actually make a contrary point, saying that in the essence, while the geography in the neighborhood remains more or less constant, which has, we all know, lent a distinct advantage to India, but the gap that earlier existed between the economies are now closing. Whether it is in per capita, whether annual growth rate, whether HDI factors, Nepal, Bangladesh, for instance, have overtaken India in many instances, and many of the neighbors are doing a very well catch up. So in that sense, the neighborhood is actually changing. But the moot question here is whether the state behavior is changing or not, because we need to do a lot of realignment in the region because of that. Unfortunately, the way I see it, that is not happening. I think the old legacy continues, which has also created gaps in the neighborhood policies that India has undertaken. Thirdly, and not because I study neighborhood, but I sincerely believe that neighborhood is assuming greater salience in India's foreign policy goals now. Earlier, we often talked about how managing relationship was important, but right now, the way we see it, whether it's Bangladesh, whether it's Bhutan, whether it's Nepal, and even Sri Lanka, they are key players in India's larger foreign policy goals. Here, I'm of course referring to the regionalism that India is, pushing forward, and a lot of the inputs that goes into India's larger foreign policy goals is actually these neighbors are going to play a key role, and I think that's how the realignment is required in terms of encouraging that whole fabric to change and the landscape to kind of take in all the players together, which again I would say that it's a work in progress, hasn't happened, but it's something that we understand that how critical these players are. I mean, neighborhood is always important, but I think right now they've acquired a salience which wasn't there in the past. I fourthly argue that for India, the neighborhood is going to be less reliable, and in some periods less stable, if not also volatile. As I see this, India would be needing to ensure a balance and work on immediate objectives rather than being able to work on long-term objectives and vision. I think that is another issue that we will have to learn to deal with, that, we can't have like a 100 years vision. We've never had that, but I'm just saying that even though attempt was made, given the volatility, given the lack of reliability, I would say, to use the word, that India will continue to strive for incremental progress rather than very dramatic, unexpected gains. And here I would, add a caution that Bangladesh and the Sheikh Hasina experience is an aberration. It's not the rule for the next 50 years, either for Bangladesh and India or for the neighbors in India. So it's not something that we can fall back on always. Fifthly, and I think that's an important issue always, that security is the core issue for India. Irrespective of what other things are in place and what are the major initiatives that are being taken by India in the neighborhood, I think if India's security issues is addressed, then a lot is going to happen. And I think Bangladesh is a case in point, that once that was happened, India was happy to roll out the red carpet. But just as we see now, the domestic developments in each of these neighbors have obviously a very specific bearing and have often complicated the matters. We've seen that often. But more importantly, I think the new complication right now, as we see it, is the role of the extra-regional player. And I certainly refer here to China. I don't think any discussion in the neighborhood is possible without referring to China. Some of my colleagues have earlier also said that China is the non-resident power in South Asia, and this is now going to be a determining factor in how India and the neighborhood actually takes this walk together. My seventh point is that India has very purposefully been moving away from bilateralism to the regional route. And we know that neighbors feel more comfortable in a regional design that incorporates bilateral priorities but offers regional solution. I think this has been something that the neighbors have always been seeking. But we know that India was late in that making headway, but a start has been made. And I think the cross-border transport linkages that India is now working on very, very purposefully. Bangladesh, of course, a key player in that. So is Nepal. And that whole sub-regional experience that we are trying to hope, I think it's going to open up huge prospects for trade and commerce in the sub-region. But again, as I said, a lot of work needs to be done. We know how Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal motor vehicle agreement didn't get signed. We didn't understand the signals from Bhutan very clearly. So again, we are reworking on the agreement. The problem is that while on the physical structure cross-border with Bangladesh, we've certainly made huge progress. With Nepal, we're working on it. Of course, on the Myanmar side, there is some work in progress too. Again, for domestic factors, that there's been stymied. But it's something that has been delayed inordinately in many ways. In having this sub-regional transport landscape, and I know that it's going to change matters in the sub-region, but it hasn't, and that's I think a problem that we know about, the problems of delay that happens in the region. Some, of course, are beyond anybody's control, but the point is, the bottom line is that we are still not able to deal with those delays. And while the hard infrastructure is being built, the soft infrastructure simultaneously the work is on. But again, when we can ensure that a sub-regional, the progress is in place, is something that we are looking out for. So let me just, close in here by saying that the way South Asian neighborhood has been conceptualized, it has been actually very different in the mental maps of the different actors, whether they're local actors, regional actors. While there is a perceived interest in the benefits of cooperation in the sub-region, the interest in themselves have not and did not trigger a regional solidarity. This is, I think, a core issue within the neighborhood that India is dealing with. Also, and I think somebody has asked a question on SAARC, and here the point here is like whether, we look at the larger South Asian region, every country is in different stages of development. So to actually synchronize your needs and your, what you require is actually very, very different. While some of our right now are very market oriented, some are in the process. So integration opportunity right now is really at the lowest common denominator. Let me close this here by saying that while India's relationship with the neighborhood continues to be a work in progress, as I see it just now, the neighborhood unfortunately will not be a source of strength for India, and really not the best showcase of an effective foreign policy for the next decade at least. But it's a work in progress, and there has been some very positive development, but a lot needs to be done here. I close here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Sreeradha. I think that question about SAARC was being asked in the text. And Ashish Nandi has a very interesting take on how all South Asian states are fundamentally artificial creations. So if you look at Nazrul Islam, which Sreeradha would know much better than I do, or Rabindranath Tagore, or even historians A.L. Basham, they have looked at this Indic civilization in a subcontinental mode. And creation of multiple states has fundamentally been a fight to define yourself other than being Indic civilization. And the disconnect has been the way to build your identities in that sense. I think that underlines the difficulties that SAARC has been facing, despite the fact that SAARC has also achieved a lot of things. We'll come back to a discussion if there are more questions on that. We now have the last speaker. Again, he's a well-known professor of international relations from a very beautiful Leiden University. He's also the director of their master's program. And in that sense, he's fairly active, as I noticed, on social media, YouTube, and I could see some of his lectures being delivered at other places. Dr. Nicolas Blarel is going to speak on India's West Asia policy in general. And I'm reminded, if you allow me in 30 seconds, of a very interesting episode way back, I think in 60s, when OIC was being created. A man called Fakhruddin Ali Ahmad was to lead India's delegation to the first meeting. The man was to later become the president of Indian Republic. And Pakistan at that stage was the United Pakistan, so world's largest Muslim country. And General Ayub Khan put his foot down that if Indian delegation is seen in the inaugural meeting, he will walk back and go back to Pakistan, which made Indian delegation return without appearing in that meeting. And you saw what happened when Sushma Swaraj was invited and Pakistani Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi put the foot down. They said, you need not come, and she went ahead and addressed the plenary. So it's an interesting shift in foreign policy over years when you look at West Asia, and I look at how India today has fantastic engagements with everyone. Countries that don't see eye to eye with each other are all talking to India today. Of course, there are distinctions. One can keep talking about hiccups and other issues that India has kind of juggled in these multiple relationships. But it's interesting to see Dr. Blarel enlighten us how he looks at India's engagement with West Asia and the GCC particularly. Nick, floor is yours now.
Thank you, Prof. Swaran Singh, for those kind words and for talking about a very interesting anecdote. I think a lot has changed between 1969 and 2019 when External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj participated in Abu Dhabi at the plenary, the OIC. And I also wanted to thank Nice and Pramod, obviously, for inviting me. This good opportunity to discuss in such a distinguished panel also about India and Modi's foreign policy. I'm going to talk very briefly again, and we can leave it to the Q&A about Modi's foreign policy towards West Asia and especially towards the Gulf states, because I think there's been a drastic change, especially since 2015, and to evaluate whether it is driven mostly by the Modi government or this was a long-term kind of a pattern. This is building on findings from a paper which is publicly available. I'm sorry for pitching it, but I can't go much into the details. In a special issue, actually, Professor Happymon Jacob and Professor Rajesh Rajagopalan also participated in international politics. So Modi's foreign policy, I think, has drastically changed towards West Asia, especially since 2015. For the first year of Modi's foreign policy, there hasn't been much of an interest in the Middle East or West Asia. There was a lot, I mean, it's been diplomatically active. We always talked about Prime Minister Modi traveling across the world, making all these multiple visits, but he hadn't traveled to West Asia until August 2015, and his first trip is to Abu Dhabi. So that was already an interesting signal. There hadn't been a visit in the 80s from a prime minister. And he, since then, has traveled to most of these important actors in the Middle East, as Professor Swaran Singh was mentioning, even first public visit of a standing prime minister to Israel in 2017. And Prime Minister Modi has also gone to Tehran, to Saudi Arabia, and multiple times, etc. So this is an interesting public acknowledgement of all these ties with all the major actors, which previous governments had refrained from doing. There was engagement, but never as public before. And it's been able to maintain these important ties with all actors and to stay very public in support with for instance, to the Palestinian Authority. This is something also which has been discussed and debated a lot over the last few weeks with the recent Gaza crisis. Did Modi's public engagement of Israel compared to previous government change its policy towards the Palestine question? And obviously hasn't, if you look at multilateral fora, it's maintained its traditional kind of rhetoric in strong support of the Palestinian Authority, if not, kind of muted criticisms of Hamas to some degree, but very public engagement of and support of the Palestinian Authority. So this is maybe what has been considered, at least at the end of Modi's first term, as a very successful kind of achievement of Modi, is to be able to engage at a high level the GCC and Israel and maintain ties with all actors. But if you look at actually this series of initiatives that the Modi government there's in the MEA, there's been the Think West, Look West, Link West, Act West, Go West. There's all these different labels, but has there been such a strategic and long-term thinking behind this position, or is it more a perception of India that's changed, right, over time in West Asia and the Middle East? So what I'm trying briefly to talk about here is what are the reasons behind this apparent change, and maybe we can talk a little bit what could happen in the coming months and years with India's position. And I think there's three things I think that change. One is the perception of interest has slightly changed. I think there's a continuity from previous government, and especially from the previous Congress 10-year government, of that multi-engagement with all relevant actors is necessary to preserve India's interest, whether it's energy, whether it is defense with Israel, whether it is preserving the welfare also of the very important Indian diaspora in the Middle East, especially in the Gulf states, about 8 to 9 million, depending on different estimates. So these are all, important interests that India has always recognized, and this is not just the Modi government. What I think has changed is there's more, during the Modi government, is a perception of security and strategic interest that is actually higher, especially with the GCC. That, the India's direct domestic security could involve better collaboration or engagement with the GCC, especially Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So there's been increasing cooperation when it comes to counterterrorism, when it comes to terror finance, actually terrorist potential safe havens, a lot of extradition agreements over the last few years. And also, as Professor Jacob mentioned earlier, it's increasingly a lot of the GCC have no longer criticized the Modi government or India for its counterterrorism policy, for its own domestic policies vis-a-vis Kashmir, etc. So there's been also this interesting development about a greater engagement of the GCC means also diluting a little bit Pakistan's traditional influence, because it was the sole maybe kind of actor in that region for a while. So again, this is, I think, important. And if you look at there's another direct, I think, change is building on the diaspora to improve ties with the GCC. Along the diaspora was kind of this difficult issue to mention in bilateral talks with the GCC, because it was seen as more of a problem that, these interconnected domestic issues both in India and in the GCC. But you've seen, if you look at this statement or speech from Dr. Jaishankar when he was Foreign Secretary in 2015 at one of the Raisina dialogues, that a lot of the what happened in India's engagement with the Middle East and West Asia was an evolutionary happening that was autonomous of strategic calculations, dictated more by markets than by policy. So it's really important for India now to build on this kind of these social and economic forces to improve ties at a strategic level with the GCC and other actors in the region. So this is also an interesting public engagement. So what you see is an increase, this increase in public exchanges, but also visits and institutionalized partnerships a little bit more over the last decades, but building a lot on what had happened and what had already been negotiated and started by previous governments. So a change in the perception of interest and a willingness to build on this interest. I think another issue is perception of India's capacities has changed. There's a lot of shedding of the defensiveness when engaging all these regional players. It's not that India was not engaging all these players, is that it was not traveling or publicly engaging both Israel and Iran and Saudi Arabia at the same time. You didn't have all these prime ministerial visits and these important bilateral statements happening roughly in the matter of a few weeks, sometimes separated. So again, this is something that's, I think, very important. Also, no longer that much the defensiveness when it comes to domestic politics, which are no longer perceived as a constraint, whether it is internal communal kind of relations and appeasing maybe the Muslim population when it comes to supporting Israel, other actors in the region. So again, shedding kind of this kind of defensiveness when it comes to domestic politics. I mentioned already this diaspora no longer considered as a liability. There's also all these new migration governance initiatives that have been happening under the Modi government, again, started by previous governments, but further institutionalized under the Modi government. So seen more as an advantage or something to build on to improve ties with the GCC. As I mentioned, also the Pakistan factor is no longer an obstacle. I mean, a lot of India has been able to successfully engage with a lot of the GCC without Pakistan acting as a veto player. So that's also a very important new development. So again, all these perception of India's capacities and possible to shape outcomes in West Asia have changed. And then I think one of the major changes, and that's not completely, that's partly driven by the Modi's activism, but not solely, is the change of a regional perception of India. You see a look east policy actually from a lot of direct important actors in Middle East, West Asia. Israel is a look east policy. Saudi Arabia, the UAE have a look east policy. So they've been increasingly engaging India and China over the last few years and other actors in East Asia, or Southeast Asia for that matter. There's a more direct recognition also, especially from the GCC, of India as an important emerging market for energy exports, foreign investments. There's a lot of more foreign investments from the UAE and Saudi Arabia now in India, and joint venture opportunities. So I think that's also an important economic development. There's also convergence with the GCC, as I mentioned, on shared security concerns. I mentioned counterterrorism, but also maritime security. So that's very pertinent also in the context of US, perceived at least US disengagement, if not actually actual. And again, this is pushed from the GCC level of the de-hyphenation of India and Pakistan, which India has really built on. And that's something to actually put to the credit, I think, of the Modi government and its Modi's diplomatic advisors, that they saw this kind of disenchantment from the GCC with at least Saudi Arabia and UAE with Pakistan, and building on this to further relations with these two countries. You see also perception of Israel that doesn't only see India as a defense market, it's actually its main export market, but also for agriculture, water technology, or other types of joint ventures. So again, coming back to the timing of the invitation to the OIC, I think is a very interesting indicator of a new phase of India-GCC ties, and limited criticism of a lot of the BJP's domestic policies and initiatives of the last few years, whether it is the reform of the status of Kashmir or the CAA. So I think these are important developments coming from the region and not just from India's policies. But again, there's an interactive dimension to this. So to conclude a little bit building on this, there's conditions I think are ripe for long-term kind of change, and maybe of the orthodoxy in New Delhi of the approach towards West Asia. But there are challenges. We saw there's still these strong regional divisions, fault lines in West Asia, which India has difficulties managing. Right, this multi-alignment is problematic if you're not taking sides. Some actors will expect you to take sides, or will be disappointed if you're absenting from certain votes, etc. So we saw it in the Gaza crisis. India actually disappointed both the Palestinian Authority and Israel in its position of staying equidistant. Is that a success? Maybe it is, but in the long term, what will that mean with bilateral relations with these two political entities? There's also the Iran-Saudi Arabia kind of fault line that India has to manage, that has to calibrate. And then there's the intra-Gulf divisions, which I think in the Indian diplomacy hasn't really that much dealt with or tried to understand when it comes to dealing with all these important actors. There's the position of maybe exaggerated expectations of India's role, especially when it comes to security provision, with the US perceived disengagement in the region, right? Can India step up? Obviously, it can't materially, but what would that mean for expectations of actors in the region? There's an increasing also involvement of China, which is not, I think, discussed enough publicly in the strategic elites and also at the MEA level about its relation with the Gulf states and with Israel, because all these countries also are major partnerships with China. What does that mean for India's own relations with these actors in the region? So I think what we probably will see over the next few years is this cautious, still omni-balancing of all actors, creating sometimes tensions like we saw with the Gaza crisis, maybe a subtle tilt toward the GCC vis-a-vis Iran. There's obviously been a downgrading of the relations with Iran, but it will still be there and important. And maybe a slight push for a proactive stance in some of the regional disputes, with India still trying not to be involved too much in this region. So again, that's where I'll conclude about what I think were the changes and what were the continuities with previous governments.
Thank you, Nick. And I must show my appreciation that all panelists have maintained excellent timing. So we have almost nearly an hour for discussion. So let me set few rules for the discussion. First thing, I noticed that there are several comments and questions and requests already that we are receiving from Arun Agrawal, from Neetu Kumari, from Mutjawa Tak, from Asanga, from Supavit. So we have several people interested. Let me say, let us make the room bigger. I suggest you switch on your videos so that we can see, speaker can see who is asking the question, from where the question is coming. So maybe spend 20 seconds to introduce yourself and then ask your question. And if you can identify who that question is addressed to, that will help us. But as we set this new mode of functioning now, let me go back and take advantage of being the convener here and ask one simple question and give 1 minute to each of the speakers to answer that. And that is the debate about how during Mrs. Indira Gandhi's time, the academics were saying we have moved into prime ministerial form of government, and now in Modi's time, people are saying it's a presidential form of government. You have a career diplomat as a senior minister, a cabinet minister for foreign affairs. Now, even important positions like Moscow and Washington used to be given to politicians. Let me say today, the ambassador in Moscow is a former student of my center. The ambassador to Washington, DC is a former student of my school. So presidential form of government is giving privilege. Perhaps you also see in pandemic, health minister is a doctor. So my question is simple to each panelist, and we'll go in the same order, 1 minute to each speaker. Do you think there is far too much Modi imprint on India's foreign policy? And if your answer is yes, then just give me one positive outcome of it and one negative outcome of it. And we'll start with the Professor Rajagopalan, who was underlining the continuity. So we'll begin with him, and 1 minute to each speaker, and then we'll open up discussion to everybody else. Rajesh.
Thank you, Prof. Swaran Singh. When after 2014, there was some talk about a Modi doctrine and things like that. I don't think anybody talks about a Modi doctrine anymore. I think there was initially, because of the energy that Modi was seen to have brought, and especially in contrast to the previous Prime Minister, Manmohan Singh, there was an expectation somehow that this was going to be different. But we haven't seen very much change in terms of actual Indian foreign policy. You're right when in your introductory comments you said a lot more energetic, but energy does not mean change. Like a lot of it's a lot of activity, but not really a whole lot of change. Whether you're looking at India's relations with the US, on US-India's relations with China, Pakistan, the region, it has been in the same direction, the same trajectory as what it has been for at least the last about 20 years since the nuclear tests, early 2000s. I don't think there is any sort of change as far as that goes, and I think that's understandable because there may be at the stylistic terms and things like that, but in fundamental sense there is no change. I don't think there's a change. Thank you.
Thank you. So as we say, the tools have changed and not the objectives. Dr. Xuan, floor is yours. Same question.
Oh, thank you for the question. From my personal viewpoint, I just look from the east side of India only, that is about the look at access policy. I think that it is not too much change in reality. India also follow the pragmatic approach of the international affairs. And I think that with the dynamic momentum created under Manmohan Singh, and now with more gear under Modi, and now you act is exactly before Modi was also act, but now it's clearer. That is, I think that's a positive point. And about it, I think also one thing negative with the pragmatic approach. So then in the look very carefully about the interest it gained from its move. So the withdrawal from the RCEP, regional comprehensive economic partnership, that I think is a very notable example. Although that you will now avoid from a lot of negative impact of the RCEP, but also I think that also you miss opportunity to participate in the largest FTA of the world today. Very shortly, thank you.
Thank you. Before I go to Happymon, Jacob, let me address the participants. We would like to see as many of you with us in this room, so please switch on your video if you can. And on bottom of your screen, you see on the right, there is an option for reactions. And if you click on it, there is an option for hand up. So you could raise your hand electronically. It just makes it easier for us to know how many of you wish to make a comment or ask a question. We will go to that. And let me first now ask Dr. Happymon Jacob the same question to you.
And I think that's an interesting question. My own personal view is that there's a lot more personalization of India's foreign policy today under Mr. Modi. I think it has its good elements and bad elements. Let me come to the good one first. I think it creates the situation for the country to take bold decisions. It's a powerful prime minister with a great deal of political capital to spend. So I think he can, and he has single-handedly in many cases given a new direction to India's foreign policy, and in particular India's Pakistan policy, something that I've been discussing today. But I think the downside really is that often it comes across as not well thought out, not well planned. You know, the Prime Minister or PMO makes a decision, and when PMO, it is the Prime Minister that who makes the decision. The bureaucracy, the diplomatic capital is often spent in following up what the Prime Minister has said or decided, without the bureaucracy having to do its own prior planning and the perspective planning and long-term planning, the pros and cons and all of that. So I think it's good and bad. I would sort of be more, you know, I would like a policy making system where there is a lot more consultation among various departments. Now, during the Manmohan Singh time, for example, there was a saying that that there is the Prime Minister of India and there is the External Affairs Ministry of India. So the Prime Minister would say something and the MEA would probably do. So there are issues of that kind. But I think the good thing is that if Mr. Modi is keen to effect major policy changes, he can. I think that's a good thing. But at the same time, a country like India, as complex as it is, with multiple, competing pressures and pulls, it can't work in a presidential manner. We are not primed for that. I think that's the issue.
Thank you. I think we have all read how different prime ministers have been described of their own principal advisors rather than prime ministers, and some principal advisors have been called as prime ministers. De facto. I'm avoiding to name that grapevine discussion here. And let me now request Dr. Sreeradha to answer the same.
Yes, so far as the neighborhood is concerned, I think there was a very distinct Modi imprint. I mean, if you look at the way the SARC leaders were invited for the swearing in, and again later subsequently, so there was a huge, I would say, energy being given to the neighborhood, and there was huge expectations, which is the point that I said, that because of this neighborhood first, I mean, while your motives and your objectives may be very novel, the problem is that complexities in the neighborhood don't change. I mean, it's not one van which kind of cleans up all the past problems. And the problem here is that, we have a history and a geography issue with all of them. The baggages are tremendous. So to expect that we would overcome it, and again, of course, very many deficit in planning also. I mean, the border closure, for instance. I mean, I recall how Prime Minister Modi had become so popular when he addressed the parliament in Nepal. I don't think I've ever seen such a pro-India fervor on the roads of Kathmandu. But there was a complete swing the other way. So obviously, I mean, I think we have been very, very indecisive about how we want to do it. There's a lack of planning. The intentions are correct, but somehow I think the trajectory has not been. I mean, it's filled with too many goals. We haven't had a very long term. And I think what I keep saying in the neighborhood, and I'll come to the question later, that about Sri Lanka, that we fear having frank conversations with our neighbors. I mean, if you're going to be partners in this whole growth trajectory that Prime Minister Modi is trying to sell to everybody, you also need to have some red lines settled, that yes, this is what you can expect from them, this is what you should. I think that conversation really hasn't, because we probably believe that everybody, and I think every leader says the right positive thing, that we want your good. But as I mentioned, shadows are too much. I mean, we can't overcome history, and the new player in the region has complicated matters. So while there is a very distinct element of the personality, and we keep hearing and reading as to how many of these most policies are driven by the Prime Minister. It's no more the Motley cabinet or something like that. It's really driven by the Prime Minister, which has in some cases worked against that particular instance. And in the neighborhood, I would say that it hasn't been. I mean, we've got hits and misses. Like Maldives, for instance, is working with India closely, but it's because there was a regime change in Maldives, not because there was a regime change in India. So those instances we need to factor in. So to actually think that a simple a person can drive it irrespective of what was there already there on the landscape is difficult. But neighborhood is a complex area, so there are going to be hits and there are going to be misses.
Thank you. That reminds Sreeradha of Delhi traffic. When the light turns green, the head moves faster, leaving the tail behind in that sense.
Yeah.
So before I open up the discussion, the last same question with Dr. Blarel.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. I think there's been a lot of debates about centralization and personalization of power under Modi's government. I looking specifically at West Asia, I think it was an important factor that Modi and especially the PMO decided to in 2015 to go to Abu Dhabi without consulting too much with the MEA. So there and other potential maybe actors involved into the traditional decision-making process towards that region. So I think it did change a lot of things in the years that came afterwards. I still think that it's a very complex region, as especially like the neighborhood that was mentioned before. So there are a lot of actors that have been involved traditionally in dealing with that country, and there are positions that are very important to maintain, and breaking with them could lead to some policy benefits, but also could lead to further long-term disagreements or grievances. And we see right now with this. I mean, there was a lot of frustration with the BJP and especially Modi when they came to power that there was not a stronger public engagement with Israel. The Modi government hasn't really substantially changed anything except for the public visit. The ties, the bilateral trade ties and the military defense ties are pretty much the same they were with the INC. So I don't see what Modi got more from the visit, and actually it created more expectations of a shift when it came to in multilateral fora, when it came to the position on the Israel-Palestine conflict. And that's where you saw this kind of dissonance between the position that the MEA was favoring at the UN and the position maybe that the Modi government was favoring of being a little bit more muted when it came to the conflict, or talking about retaliatory strikes against Hamas, whereas the traditional position was much more supportive of the Palestine Authority in the past, and you still see some contradictory statements coming with which institution you asked. So these are the problems with this kind of increasing centralization and not taking into account all the bureaucrats that was mentioned by Dr. Jacob, but also other other stakeholders that are involved usually in the decision making, for instance, in the neighborhood. You can't not discuss a little bit with some of the state governments, which have also a strong policy when it comes to Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, etc. So I think this, if you're in a single party majority, you think you can get away without consulting, but the democratization and kind of involvement of certain stakeholders in the foreign policy over the long term, I think, is important. So that's one of the maybe disadvantages of this centralization.
Thank you, Nick. We have still 70 participants with us. So as I keep saying, I want to encourage them to switch on their video so that we can have the room growing bigger. Speakers would feel much at home answering your questions. And if you want to make an intervention, ask a question or make a comment, please raise electronic hand. Thank you for people who had raised hand for waiting. I'll begin with my very dear friend Asanga Avayagunasekara to make his first intervention. Asanga, floor is yours. Asanga, unmute yourself.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Swaran. Thank you for the presentation. They're very informative. My question is to Sreeradha, and any other panelists can basically add to whatever they think of the Sri Lankan foreign policy, the recent tilt of Sri Lankan foreign policy towards China. If you look at the Port City Bill, there was an excellent piece of analysis done by Sreeradha. So I'd like to congratulate her on that piece. How do you see the Port City Bill, as well as the comments made by the Foreign Secretary on human rights concerns? Supporting China on Xinjiang. This is the first time we hear, from a Foreign Secretary supporting China as human rights. How do you see? You suggested incremental steps, but with the aggressive wolf warrior style coming in strategic inroads coming into countries like Sri Lanka, do you think it's sufficient to have incremental steps? I see a significant security challenge. Thank you.
Sreeradha?
Okay. Thanks, Asanga. Okay, so very quickly, the way I see it, it's not only vis-a-vis Sri Lanka, but the way China behaves with Nepal or Bangladesh or Maldives. We have always been very circumspect about it. And, for us, because, again, of the history of the geography, we've been, there's a lot of value judgment in the neighborhood from on India's point of view, which obviously China doesn't have to suffer. I mean, China, if you look at the way they've dealt with everyone, it's been, every particular political spectrum they're comfortable dealing with, but we've got a baggage there. So particularly in Sri Lanka, ever since the new government has come in, we've seen that while your foreign secretary, of course, said that the India first policy is still effective, why is it that when we are obviously very apprehensive about this Port City project and a lot of the other things, and I know India has gone to town about the debt issue. I have serious reservations on that, in the sense that if they have a debt issue, let them deal with it. Who are we to talk about it? And again, on the human rights issue, we've abstained from voting. We've again supported that. So we've done this seesaw constantly vis-a-vis Sri Lanka ourselves. So obviously, so I think what has, and the point I'm saying is incremental, is India does not have the wherewithal or the deep pockets to do a deep dive. in the sense that, like I'm saying, the cross-border transport linkages are in place, but it takes a while. I mean, we have shortages of not only funds. I mean, again, under this neighborhood is certainly remarkable compared to what was done in the past, but we don't have the wherewithal to take it forward the way China can. I mean, literally, China has been able to, within a decade, change the landscape of that particular one neighbor that we are discussing, whatever, which we don't have. So I'm saying, and that is exactly where I say frank conversations need to come in. If we are partnering with, and I think Sri Lanka and India does work closely. And again, I've argued in that article too that the Colombo City project, is where India can partner it. I mean, there is, if it's a commercial activity, economically driven, that is the scope of conversation. Are those conversations where are we not directing our thing to Sri Lanka? And I think a lot of that work, because China is able to support many of the projects in the neighborhood. We can't ignore that. Being in denial or telling them don't do that. I mean, I'll give you an instance about Bangladesh, which has left a bad taste. When China said that we were going to, let's fund the third trial and we will do that, that particular vaccine. India rushed and said, no, don't do that. We are here. We will give you the vaccine ourselves. But did you see what happened? It doesn't create good impressions. So I'm saying that we must understand our limitations, and that's why I'm saying incremental is the way ahead. We won't be able to rush in the way China can, but at the same time, I think our intentions are above board. Our objectives are very clear. We must ensure that the neighbors are with us on the same page and have these frank conversations. And I'm not surprised at all that Sri Lanka, Colombo has made its support for China so clear, because they know that they need China to take these huge projects forward. And China right now, Sri Lanka right now economically needs a huge amount of support. We've seen the kind of debt crisis which is going on. So I'm not surprised at all.
Thank you, Sreeradha. Is the next to ask the question. Pavel is a student from beautiful Xiamen University in China. So he's going to be the next one to ask questions. So Pavel, please unmute yourself and make your introduction. So Pavel, you are able, yes.
Yeah, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, my name is Supavit Kaekunok. Now I'm a PhD student in Xiamen University. I'm Thai people. So I have this question for the panelists. First is about the Indo-China relationship that I want to know that what should it be about the opportunity or the obstacle of Indo-China relationship after the Gawan issue, and it is possible in the future that India and China will come again to working together to drive the world into like the rising of Asian. And for some particular question about my region is what Southeast Asia. I want to know that what are the major changes between like the look east and act east policy after the Modi government, and I have some specific like about the issue of Myanmar that was very crucial now in this region. So how India like can play a key role in this particular problem, as like in the last situation of voting in the general in the UN, India also vote abstention about the Myanmar issue, and I just want to know in terms of the Indian foreign policy, what Indian should to pay on this particular issue. Thank you so much.
Let me rephrase this question slightly. I think it's an interesting question. I want to expand it to make it look like how far you think China is increasingly, and I'm consciously using the word determining Indian foreign policy initiatives. And I would like maybe each panelist to spend a minute or so to answer this question of Subhavid. And I'm just trying to rephrase it. So who would like to start first on this? Otherwise, I'll have to ask. Maybe this time we go in the reverse order, starting with Nick.
Okay, can I?
Yes, Nick. Is that yes, Dr. Vo?
Okay. Thank you, Professor Swaran Singh. Thank you so much, the friend from Chairperson University. He's a Thai. Thank you so much for the question. About the major change of ICT policy under Modi, I think that is, as I mentioned before, when I answered the question raised by the Professor Swaran Singh, the chair, that I think that in the is now after the Cold War is follow the pragmatic approach to the international issue, and the case of Myanmar can be the same. Further talk about the major change of ICT policy. I think that in the now act more engage more in the Asia Pacific issues due to maybe the main reason is from the rise of China and China's ambition in South Asia, in Indian Ocean. I think that the strategic scope of India, I think that is the main reason for India engage more in Asia Pacific, especially recently it joined the Quadrian security dialogue. I think that really a strategic move that never happened before. That I think that we can see. In the Myanmar case, I think that yes, nothing new in the foreign policy. As I remember that in 1992, a delegation from Myanmar to India in that meeting. Myanmar signed also said to India that be patient, that we were going to in the process of the democratization, but please patient because we face a lot of challenge. And I think that from that viewpoint are shared by India, and recently after the coup happened in February, so I think that India expressed the same speech that it had before. So I think that is the pragmatic approach is there. So then they vote or they abstain or something happened in the UN, because India understand very clearly that nothing can change in Myanmar because of the support from the Russia and China, and maybe some scale from ASEAN. So then nothing can change in Myanmar now. So India understand that, so a pragmatic approach is, I think, a good choice now for India. And I think from my personal viewpoint, that is the right track that India is now following. Thank you so much for the question.
Thank you, Dr. Moshwani. Let me go, since I had asked Nick to step in, I think I should ask him now to address this question of how far China is determining Indian foreign policy initiatives.
Yeah, I mean, I will talk more specifically with West Asia. So India and China are major actors right now in the Middle East, especially perceived increasingly so by the actors. And I mentioned we keep talking about these really good relations between India and Israel over the last 2 decades, between India and the GCC over the last 5-6 years. But China is also there. I mean, Israel-China relations are also quite important. They're inhibited at the defense level because of the triangle with the US blocking a lot of major defense exchanges between Israel and China. But if it wasn't that inhibition, I think there would have been also discussions for further defense ties. India and the GCC, there's also China there, very actually much more important when it comes to maybe not trade, but a lot of investment and also energy kind of cooperation. So again, the big question will be, right now, the two countries have been able to develop good ties with all countries in the region without any competitive dimension to it, as we see maybe in the Indo-Pacific or in the Indian Ocean or in South Asia. But there's room for a potential competition because of at one point maybe some zero-sum kind of relationships in the region, or perceived, as this perceived U.S. disengagement I mentioned. There's going to be increasing expectations from some of the actors for the countries to step in at an economic level, at a defense level, for some kind of a security provision. So what are India and China gonna do when if they're faced with those challenges and those expectations from local actors? I think India has a more historical relationship with the region that it can build on. I think compared to China, China has the financial capacities. So it's not really clear how that's going to go, and if it could go, I think, in a managed cooperative way. There was an interesting, despite the tensions between India and China have managed to develop some cooperation in trying to pressure lobby the price, the gas prices to stay at a certain level. So there has been some cooperation dialogue. They do have shared interests in the region. So we could move to a cooperative, maybe not completely friendly, but cooperative kind of modus operandi when it comes to, or vivendi when it comes to the region compared to their relations in other regions where they might be more vital interest at stakes, where it's much more difficult for them to cooperate. So I think there's potential maybe for discussion when it comes to the West Asia, Middle East, but there's also potential for competition depending on how much they're pulled into the local politics on both sides. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Blarel. I also noticed two requests. I have noted them from Afzalur Rahman and Neetu Kumari. I'll come to that, but let me go in that same sequence. Maybe Dr. Datta, you would like to take that question now?
Yes, just as mentioned during my presentation, that China is a key factor in our neighborhood policies. This is not to say that each neighbor is happy to engage with India. Absolutely, there is no doubt about that, and each one has in the last decade or so definitely deepen the engagement. There is no doubt on that, and they want to keep working with it. But at the same time, as I said, the kind of wherewithal that China has and the kind of projects that China has been able to support in the neighborhood is beyond India's means. So, they've been able to take that forward. The problem has been that at another level, China and Indian hostility is known to all. So obviously, India is very, very wary as to how China would be able to, use many of these facilities and other things that they're building against Indian interests. I think that's where the problem is. That while China is able to support the infrastructure, other projects, that's not the problem. Problem is how inimical they are to India's larger, issues. So I think that is where, as I'm saying again, the conversation is required, that every neighbor should be able to work with whoever they want. I mean, I think there's no confusion on that front, and I think there's clear clarity that just as India is working closely with every single neighbor, so any other player wants to do that. But if that is being used against India, and that's again, given the history that India and China has, I mean, the fears are well founded. So obviously China is, at this point of time, we've seen in the last 1 year or so, there's been direct hostility. So obviously we are very apprehensive, and only the neighbors can address that. India screaming on the rooftop doesn't help. The neighbors have to be sensitized to India's need. I'm sure they are. It's just that, that full-on assurance, like what Bangladesh gave to India. And the red carpet unfolded. So similarly, I'm sure it's possible to have a very frank conversation and have the red lines in place.
Thank you, Dr. Datta. I notice another colleague from SIS, Dr. Vaishali Krishna, has also joined us. I see her on my screen. Those of you who wish to make an intervention, I keep saying, please switch on your videos and raise e-hand. But let's continue in the same sequence. Dr. Jacob, you would like to take that question before we go to other participants.
Thank you. I think, as many of the other panelists have pointed out, China factor plays a major role determining and shaping India's foreign policy today in general and India's neighborhood policy in particular. I think there's no getting away from that reality. Be it Indo-Pacific, Myanmar, AFPAC, the neighborhood in general, I think the China stamp is pretty much there. And I think the question is, how is India going to navigate and negotiate that challenge, as it were? I mean, I want to very, very quickly, come to the Myanmar question. I think, for as far as India is concerned, Myanmar is a complex question. You have the Rohingya refugees in India, in many parts of India. Actually, you do have a relationship with the Tatmadaw in Myanmar. There's no point in denying that. You do have there are worries about non-Rohingya refugees now coming into India's borders in the northeast of India. So had it not been for China, I think that's the fundamental point. Had it not been for China, India would have had India's Myanmar policy would have been more articulate and would have been more clear. Today, India is having to sort of say nothing or see nothing, and we'll have to adopt that kind of a policy. And so it's unfortunately unavoidable. What do you do about it? You, unlike as again somebody pointed out, China is a non-resident power in the region. There aren't refugees running to China. Refugees are running to India, so India has to take care of those refugees. So it's a more complicated situation for India. But again, as Dr. Datta pointed out, the reality is that China has deeper pockets. Even on soft power, I think China's traction is increasing in the region. I mean, in Nepal, for example, the kind of a software influence in Nepal is increasing on a daily basis. I think India will have to, go back to some of its civilizational connects and, have a more open democratic conversation with the neighborhood and promote some of the democratic values, which China, of course, doesn't have. I think that is a route to take. And I think there's no point in denying the reality of the fact that China is a shaper of the region and increasingly of India's foreign policy towards the region too. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rajagopalan. Your 1 minute, and then we open up to other comments.
Thank you, Professor. Yeah, I mean, I think there is little doubt that China would be a factor in South Asia. All of India's neighbors are obviously much smaller than India and much weaker than India. And so it's only natural. This is nothing new. I mean, it's not even before China became as powerful as it has become over the last 20 years. So India's neighbors were looking to see whether anybody else outside would be able to help them balance against India. I mean, this is, it's perfectly natural behavior on the part of India's neighbors. Of course, until China became as strong as it has become, there wasn't anybody else who was interested in helping India's neighbors, with the exception of Pakistan, China axis. But outside of that, there wasn't anybody else who was interested in helping them. So they couldn't get that level of support. But now it is clear that that they would, and what they are doing vis-a-vis India and China is what India did vis-a-vis the United States and Soviet Union during the Cold War period. I mean, play one off against the other to get the best of both sides and to get the best benefits from both sides. India was the largest recipient of economic assistance from the United States during the Cold War. Most people don't realize that, but also obviously enormous amount of military and diplomatic support from the Soviet Union. So we played both off against each other and got the best from both. And that is exactly what our neighbors are doing. And that's exactly what they would do. I mean, there's nothing, I find this, I find this perfectly natural, what they're doing, perfectly natural. And that's why I said in my comments that India will have to improve its game. I mean, and India, it already has. I mean, to some extent, it goes back to the Gujarat doctrine and whatnot, but it's become a lot more, we have become a lot more sensitive precisely because the game has become a lot more difficult. I mean, because China is there, and China is interested for its own reasons, obviously, undermining India's place in the region. And, the parallel is what's happening in Southeast Asia. India's relations with Southeast Asian countries, with Japan, with South Korea, and so on, also Australia, all have improved dramatically precisely because they feel the pressure from China, right? I mean, so in China's neighborhood, we play the same game, right? And that's, again, it's a parallel that we see between Southeast Asia, what India's role in Southeast Asia and China's role in South Asia. So I don't think there is, I would slightly disagree with Professor Jacob in terms of the civilizational roots. I think the civilizational roots is exactly the wrong thing to do, because for the simple reason that I think Professor Singh mentioned this earlier in his opening remarks, that the fact that it is all of that has roots in all of the region has a root in India, presents a kind of identity crisis for most of our neighbors. And again, we have to understand that. I mean, what they want is distinction from India, not and talking about the common cultural roots and identity roots will actually hurt us in terms of gaining support in the region. So this is, if you look at regionalism and the way regionalism is played out in different parts of the world, in Europe, it was that common European home, the notion of a common European home, the notion of Greco-Roman sort of heritage and Christian heritage that was partly at least a link, a cultural link that brought Europe together. We don't have that. We have that, but playing that up is actually potentially problematic for us, because that would actually create problems for our neighbors. And so I think we should underplay that aspect. We should recognize that China is an important player, because of its wealth and its power, and that our neighbors will play us off against each other. And we just have to improve our game. That's something, there is no real solution here. The solution is only to improve our capacity to deliver, which touches upon a whole lot of issues having to do with our own state capacity and things like that. But if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen.
Thank you, Rajesh. I will now invite Neetu Kumari to please unmute, introduce yourself very briefly, and then ask your question or make your comment. If you can identify who that comment or question is meant for, that will be easier for us. Yes, Neetu, floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. I'm Neetu Kumari. I'm an assistant professor in National Law University, Nagpur. I'm very forward. My question is to Happy, sir. Sir, I think I can tell you that from childhood, we are actually reading your article or your books related to traditional security concept.
He's not that
so
old.
Every time, whenever...
He's very young.
Yeah, I think... Yes, sir. But I think whatever discussion, whenever we are talking about rise of Asia or Asia's foreign policy, most of the, I think more than 70% discussion is only related with the traditional security concept. But we are actually not giving attention on the non-traditional security concept. That is actually, after this COVID-19, it became a very big issue, especially related to health and other things. So what is your comment, or I think your idea, because you are a very prominent person in this concept, that how we can shift our discussion towards from very traditional concept to non-traditional security concept. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, Dr. Jacob, please unmute.
Thank you, Neetu. You made me out to be very old, but that's perhaps I am. I think this is an interesting question. We are increasingly discussing about non-traditional security issues these days in the wake of COVID and pollution and watershed problems. I think this discussion needs to be mainstream. If you actually look at the community that discusses water issues, the community that discusses environment, the community that discusses pollution, there's a lot of discussion going on there in both within India and across the region. The reality is that those discussions do not come to the mainstream sort of foreign policy, national security sort of landscape. I think that's where the problem is. You're absolutely right. There's a crying need to talk about river water management, for example, in South Asia, be it India, Nepal, India, Bangladesh, including India, China, or a cross-regional dialogue on river water management. There is a need to talk about, for example, climate change and pollution in the region. The Punjab government in India and the Lahore Punjab government on the other side should actually talk about crop burning and pollution and things of that kind. In the immediate wake of COVID, there was some discussion led by India to some extent on medical regionalism, right? Prime Minister Modi called a couple of meetings, and including the Pakistani side, all of them attended. But the reality is that it didn't really take any concrete shape thereafter. But I think it is increasingly important for, just to give you one example, Pakistan stopped all trade with India in the wake of the 2019 decisions, except for necessary medicines. Because Pakistan realized that it is impossible for Pakistan to buy medicines cheap from elsewhere but from India. So I think there are these areas where we need to, one, focus, and two, bring those discussions to the mainstream. There is therefore necessary to mainstream the non-traditional security issues into the regular mainstream security sphere. But thank you for asking that question.
Thank you. I'll next ask Afzalur Rahman, if you're with us. I don't see you on my screen as of now. Afzalur Rahman, if you're with us, I'm asking you to switch on your video. Otherwise, I'll go to the next. I think Atul Agarwal had also made a request earlier. Atul,
Okay. Thank you very much for giving me the floor.
Please.
My first question is, I'm myself Assistant Professor Afzalur from University of Chittagong, Bangladesh. My first question is, I say that on the perspectives of India-Bangladesh relations, before that I just mentioned two events. One is the sudden Indian cancellations of onion to Bangladesh in consecutive 2 years. In 2 months ago, India also cancelled to the, 3 crore vaccine where Bangladesh got the 17 lakh. I mentioned a context that in last year, China approved Bangladesh to trial their vaccine in Bangladesh. So as Bangladesh and India having a good relations over there, Bangladesh declined that. And Bangladesh is the only country in the South Asia who only, import the Indian, Serum Institute vaccine, and all the other countries having a several treaty with China and Russia, in fact, Nepal and Sri Lanka too. I say, do you think that those events certain cancellations to the very trusted allies lessen the credibility of India's neighbor in South Asia like Bangladesh? So this is the first question. Second question is, how do you see the, Indian apathy to the water sharing with Bangladesh when it comes to the Tista, and there are more, at least 54, combined water that share with India and Bangladesh. Even one speaker, respected speaker, talks focus about the India and Pakistan having treaty like Sindhu Basin equally shared by both of the side, but Bangladesh having a kind of Bangladeshi side feel that we're neglected. Okay, how do you see that issues? Okay, and third one is, as India is going through the unprecedented challenges now, so do you think that COVID will reshape the Indian neighborhood policy in South Asia? Okay, so as South Asian neighbors are more, close to the China more than ever before. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Rahman. 3 questions. I suppose Dr. Datta would be answering your questions.
Okay, let me begin with Tista. Yes, I do understand that, and I think I've written and spoken about this always, that for Bangladeshis, water is the most emotive issue. No matter what are the agreements we sign, we don't do, but if water is something that, that's everyone across the board in Bangladesh, somebody working with foreign policy, a complete layman, water issue is actually for them the core issue. And not signing of Tista has actually created a lot of ill feelings. I do understand that. But 2 main points. One is, if we sign the Tista agreement, we, all of us, and one understands it's not only a center state issue. The problem was that we never had a proper study about the Tista flows. I'm from that region. For the last 30 years, I've seen how water flows has diminished. My argument always has been that if I sign the Tista agreement, I will not be able to guarantee you any extra cusecs of water. See, the problem always about water sharing is not on the, it's only during the dry season. So this is basically June, July that we are looking at so far as Tista is concerned. So if the 2 countries and 2 partners who are working so much on other factors and other issues can work that out, that how do you augment water which is excessive during the monsoon and other times to be used during the drought season? Because the rest of the year, it's not so much of a problem. It's just those 2 months. So, that's something. And also, I think all of us will have to, again, change from the traditional way of looking at water. It's not the cubic flows anymore. It is how much of water do you need for your cropping patterns? How much of water does the other country need for their cropping patterns? And again, as in the partnership, we should be able to, if you need a particular kind of rice or a particular kind of crop, we should be able to grow that for you, and vice versa. So I think that conversation needs to change between cusic flows. It has to change between what is required and what is, what you need. That, and also I think there was a reference made by Happymon, I think, that we have to look at basin management. I think that conversation was flagged in one of the earlier agreements in 2011, if I'm not mistaken. It hasn't been taken so far, but I think we have to stop looking at each other as bilateral, one particular river flow to the other. While 54 rivers can't be discussed together for obviously geographical landscape reasons, but certainly I think we can look at it in the basin management, and I think there has been some progress. And at the same time, I do understand that at a very non-official level, even at a think tank level, many of us have been part of the conversation on river flows and water flows. The second point about the vaccine, I said, I don't know how much of you noticed, Azalubhai, that in India, we ourselves had a vaccine drought. We weren't not able to produce as much. So there was obviously a lack of calculation as to how much we were be able to, develop. So we were not, it's not only that we were not giving to Bangladesh, we were not giving it to our own citizens. We had to step back our programs. Of course, I'm hoping that problem has been now, restored, and there would be more going. And I mean, I'm aware of that, and I think I did make a reference to this COVID vaccine diplomacy. That is it something that should not have happened, and it's unfortunate, but I think there was a problem in the planning and how even Indian citizens themselves were not able to avail of it as per the schedule. Thirdly, I think pandemic has changed the way, and if you recall, Prime Minister Modi had invited a meeting for all the SAARC countries to discuss not only that time in terms of what was the line of credit that we could do to support each other, but I think a conversation has to move and look at public health. India again has been a prime mover in South Asian public health. Everybody, I mean, medical tourism is something that every country looks at India for. So I think India would be able to support that. Again, India is very strong in pharmacy. That's again an industry that India would be looking at working with. I think education and health are the two main core issues that jumps up at this post-pandemic level. And again, I agree with what Happymon said, that we need to have mainstreaming of these ideas and take these things forward. While the security and other traditional problems will remain, they will be addressed, but these non-traditional factors are becoming more and more important on a day-to-day basis for every citizen of South Asia. I hope that answers yours.
Thank you. We have to now move into rapid fire session because we have about 6 minutes left before I hand over. And I have requests from Tanupriya, I have requests from Arun Agrawal, and I see Maitri Goha and Vaishali Krishna also on my screen in case they want to say something. So let me begin with Arun Agrawal, but we have to move a little faster now given the fact that we have 6 minutes. Arun. Unmute yourself, Arun, and then ask your question.
Am I audible now, sir?
Yes.
So thank you very much, Dr. Xuan, for giving me this opportunity. A part of my question has already been covered by Dr. Sreeradha, but my question goes to Dr. Jacob and Dr. Sreeradha regarding the relevance of SAARC. Because 2014, when the present government came, so they started with SAARC, and it was on a very, very high note and a very high pitch, and we also wanted to invite Pakistan. But now, 7 years hence, why has SAARC become so irrelevant? Whereas it is a very, very good business model if you look at it. And with the Make in India policy, which the present government has taken up, expansion of Make in India towards the SAARC nations can really boost economy, and it can take care of many other factors like migration or even terrorism, poverty and all. So I think strengthening the SAARC, before we start looking out at other things like Quad, they're all relevant, SEO, Quad and all that. But strengthening SAARC, I think, should be something which we should strengthen now.
Thank you, Arun. Let me also acknowledge, I see Professor Sharad Soni also on my screen, in case he wants to also intervene and say something later. But now let me request Happymon, Jacob and Sreeradha, maybe a minute or less is better. Happy, you can start first.
Right. Thank you. I think that's a very relevant question, Mr. Agarwal. I have always argued, and I have no doubt in my mind that SAARC is a vehicle for India to strengthen regional arrangements in South Asia. Of course, there have been difficulties in the past, especially with Pakistan, but those difficulties will continue. If India can be part of SCO with China and Pakistan in it, with China and Russia ganging up, I see no reason why India should not, invest in SAARC. At the end of the day, this is one, regional arrangement where India has a certain sway, right? I mean, with RCEP, we are not part of RCEP. We don't know where BBIN is going, and with SEO what it is. I think it is only natural for us to sort of invest more in SAARC in the years to come. I have absolutely no doubts in my mind about that.
Thank you. Sreeradha can tell us where BBIN is going.
Yeah, very quickly, I think SAARC is core to South Asia. So there is no walking out of SAARC. I think we all want SAARC to, function properly. But of course, facts are all on the table as to why it's not a fully functional organization. But again, as I said in the initial remarks, that whether if it's Afghanistan at one level and with Sri Lanka, the needs and requirements of every SAARC member is different. So you can walk along on a main platform so far as terrorism is concerned, on something like education is concerned. But in terms of even commercial activities, which is something that I think trade SAPTA would actually be very effective, it is difficult. So I think sub-regionalism within SAARC is actually going to be far more effective. Again, we faced BBIN, as I mentioned, we were thinking all the 4 countries together. We didn't realize that Bhutan had these issues in terms of certain they did. Again, first they're looking at commercial vehicle and relay. So if we are able to use the kind of transport linkages that we have built in the sub-region, I'm sure we'll be able to strengthen this particular sub-region effect and take it forward. And I know while SAARC is right now not on the radar, but it's something that all of us within South Asia would want to make it much more functional. And I think the way forward is to again find ways, nooks and corners as to how we can make it. And I think Prime Minister Modi, I would say, has done every opportunity he has taken to ensure that we can build. I mean, even during pandemic, he called for a SAARC meeting. But unfortunately, there are the realities which hold this organization back.
Thank you. Tanupriya had raised hand. I don't see her on my screen right now. Tanupriya, if you are there with us. Shashwat has raised his hand. Shashwat, can you switch on your video and come alive and introduce yourself? Shashwat, are you able to hear me? 30 seconds.
Yes, so I have 2 questions. One, which is between Eurasian landmass and Indian Ocean maritime space, which seems to be emerging as India's primary strategic direction. And how will India deal with contradictions in the US-led Indo-Pacific construct, which is a maritime strategy with India's 2-front challenge along its land frontier in the Himalayas, where US priorities do not necessarily converge with those of India? And related to with this, the second question, which is related to balancing China. How sustainable, given the above aforementioned sort of contradiction, is a hard balancing strategy vis-a-vis China that does not look at a combination of cooperation and competition?
Thank you. I would like to give that question to Dr. Xuan. Is he with us? Dr. Wo, are you with us still?
Yes, here I am. Thank you so much for the question. I think it's a really nice, interesting question. Yes, I think it's just something very, contradiction in the US approach to India in terms of the Indo-Pacific. In fact, that one side, US see that India is very important, a very key pillar that come from India. So without India, so yes, it's not Indo-Pacific. Although the explanation for Indo-Pacific is Indian Ocean, not India, but the importance of India importantly construct the Indo-Pacific. That's the first point. The second point, I think that India really, US really want to engage into the Pacific to counterbalance China, or to I think to contain China. That is more exact. That is the thing. But you know that from other side, I think not from US side, but from India, that policy of India is not to align with US. That is the fact. Although in something you can see it that it aligns in nature, like in 2020 in February, the joint declaration between Modi and US president is they mention about the sovereignty debt. They mention about the transport of the military technology. That I think that only happened between the two allies, not between normal countries. So then.
Dr. Wu, I have to stop you there. There is one last question from Devina. Are you with us? 30 seconds to you if you want to ask.
Okay, very soon. So then that in one thing that you see that it is contradiction, but
I have to stop you.
Okay, sorry. Okay.
Last question of the day, last question of the session. Devina, are you with us? Take 30 seconds, shoot your question.
Yes, sir, I am here with everyone. First of all, greetings to all the eminent panelists. It's such a pleasure to be in the presence of so many wonderful people. And yes, and my question, so I'm afraid it's not very well structured, but I will tell you the key phrase around what it's focused around. I'm a scholar from India. I'm currently working on the South China Sea issue. So I'd like to ask whoever can answer, what can India employ, like what strategies can India employ to raise its popularity and reliability in the South Asian region so as to compete effectively with China? Since we know
Marina, we understood your question. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Let me, since I stopped Dr. Wu, would you like to take this question another 30 seconds?
30 seconds. I think that there are some things that India can do. The first, bilaterally, you should deploy more naval ships there, then continue with the ONGC project in the South China Sea, in the EEZ of Vietnam or some other claimant in the South China Sea. And the third, very important, that you can have joint naval exercise with a lot of countries there with the phone of in the South China Sea as in freedom of navigation that do that. So that is internationally with legally that is, I think. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Let me use my last 30 seconds to first of all thank all the participants. We've been able to power punch so much of debate on Indian foreign policy. Thanks to all my panelists. What we get here at end of the discussion in another 20 seconds is that there is a lot of bold initiatives. There is lack of well planning. There is lack of follow-up. It's also increasingly, in some sense, becoming far more centered around the Prime Minister. But nevertheless, it's only change in tools, as one of the panelists said. It's not change in fundamental structure and then the vision of Indian foreign policy. In that sense, continuity still is overcast on the way foreign policy is organized. But nevertheless, enormous footprint is visible, both from Indian initiatives, but also underlined as to how other countries are also increasingly willing to engage India. And I think to some extent, the drift toward United States and tension with China are important factors in the discussion. I'm delighted that participants supported my effort to keep the timing and power punch as much as we could in this discussion. Thank you, everyone, all the participants, people who asked questions. Thank you, nice Nepal team also to ask me to chair today's session on Indian foreign policy. Back to nice Nepal team for formal vote of thanks.
Thank you, sir. So
thank you.
We'll have vote of thanks to all the speakers at the end.
Distinguished Chair, speakers, ladies and gentlemen, as we have come to the end of this session, we would like to express our sincere gratitude and thanks to the Chair for agreeing to chair and moderate the session today. Our sincere thanks also goes to all the speakers for being a part of the event and delivering such comprehensive and convincing presentations. We would like to acknowledge our gratitude to our friends from the diplomatic community, experts, academia, media, and different organizations. Finally, we must also mention our deep sense of appreciation for the audience who participated in the webinar and those who are watching us live. Thank you for your valuable time and attention. and for making this session productive with your questions. Once again, we are truly honored to have you all with us today. Please do join us in the next session. Thank you so much.